Hello.
Hello, I believe we are live now. Welcome to the very first Musicology horror show.
Or horror musicology show?
It could be both, it could be either. Here we will speak about all things in music that are creepy and scary, and all things that music is used to make creepier and scarier.
And more awesome.
And more awesome.
Indeed.
And with that, let us introduce the co-hosts. So I will introduce Kamala. And Kamala, some of you may not know, she's a virtuoso of the death metal accordion. She's also a composer of great renown, but she's humble. There's no hint of Kanye there. And she shares a first name with the future Vice President of America.
So I expect you all to learn how to pronounce it, finally. Does it mean it's my turn?
Yes, it does.
Oh, good. I have the extreme pleasure of introducing Maestra Whitney George, who is not only a fantastic conductor, but also a composer of music that is beautifully dramatic in its melodic and harmonic scope. And I just discovered this evening that she has written the first opera film about Julie Daubigny, who is a bisexual mezzo-soprano who is also a swords master, which is the most fucking awesome thing I've ever heard in my life. So,
Thank you very much.
That is incredibly awesome.
Thank you. I have the great pleasure of getting to introduce Joanie. Joanie, she is indeed a vocalist who is most often cast as a coloratura soprano, singing the highest and brightest notes humanly possible. I thought I would share with you all my two favorite roles that I've gotten to hear Joanie perform in. One of them is in Not an Opera, which indeed features a potato aria, which is excellent.
I ate mashed potatoes while singing.
It was
#life goals.
Yes, and I wore a sparkly unisuit or something and a propeller hat. So it was outside of my realm.
I carried an inflatable dolphin.
And also an inflatable
high
dolphin.
art
Yes.
at its finest.
Yeah, absolutely. But her other role that I most admire her in is in Miriam Gideon's Fortunato, and Joanie, you were really awesome in that. So I happen to have gotten to work with Joanie as a vocalist through conducting, and I can't say enough about her as a vocalist, most certainly. But beyond that, let's talk about other accolades that Joanie has. She is, of course, she has been trying her hand and majorly succeeding at piano tuning, which I think is awesome. But beyond that, she's also a theremin enthusiast, and we hope to get to hear her amazing skills.
Yes, I can play a major scale.
that is better than John Spencer.
Yeah. It is a challenge. So tonight on the Musicology Horror Show, we are talking about the tritone, aka the devil's interval. Hence this is always here. I just usually glamour it away. What? Nothing.
Am on a show?
So
Oh my god.
we're informal here.
Yes.
We're glad to see him. So tonight we're going to talk about the tritone, and I'm going to turn it to Kamala first to talk about what the tritone is and the definition of what consonance and dissonance really is.
Sure. So, in its most simplest definition, the tritone is simply an augmented fourth, which doesn't really seem that bad, right? Except if you dig in deeper, then you learn about the sordid history of the tritone, which involves roughness. That's right, I said roughness, because what the tritone is about roughness. So if you look at the history of harmony in European classical music, and we're not going to go into non-European classical music because they don't care about the tritone as much. This is really a white people thing. So a lot of what's interesting about how we have approached harmony and the development of harmony throughout European classical music is this idea of consonance versus dissonance. So what do we like to listen to versus what do we think doesn't sound so nice? And because of the tuning systems that were used early on, which I think Joanie is going to talk about in a second, for a long time, the tritone did not sound so nice. And the reason for that is that because when you have frequencies of sound that are close to each other, they create this acoustic phenomenon that is called roughness. And so I'm going to show you what that sounds like right now in case you have never experienced it for yourself. Because basically the way that sound waves interact with each other is that, you don't want to see well, maybe you do. So this is what we're going to do is I'm going to play you a couple of sine waves. And what happens is that when they start to cancel each other out, you hear these gaps in the sound that first sound like kind of a whoa, 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 whoa sound, and then it becomes an actual cancellation where you get missing parts of the sound wave. So let's hear what this sounds like.
So like noise canceling.
Oh, yes, noise canceling. So you'll see here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bend this sine wave so that it's slightly off. And then finally I get to where they sound like different notes and I don't have the same sense of roughness anymore. But if I bring it back down where the frequencies are really close together again, you hear that whoa, 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 whoa sound. That is the sound waves canceling each other out. And as it turns out, our brains do not like this. And part of the reason for that is that the way that we perceive sound is actually mapped physically onto our ear. Sound is a pressure wave, and so our ear is the only body part that actually is mechanically turning a sound signal into a signal to the brain, and that you have all of these stereocilia in your ear, in the cochlea, in what's called the basilar membrane, and they're stuck to this tectorial membrane, and so when the actual sound wave is vibrating, they're vibrating, and it makes them bend, and that is what allows them to depolarize and to send a signal to your brain. So it's the actual physical movement of the sound wave that sends the signal, and so the sounds are frequency mapped onto the basilar membrane, and that high sounds are in a different place than low sounds. And so what that means is that if the sounds are too close together, they're actually interacting with each other and canceling each other out. And the other part of that is that the frequencies are time synced with the firing rate of your neuron. So if I have a frequency of 440 hertz, then my neuron is actually firing at 440 times per second in precise synchrony with the sound wave. And so again, if you have these sound waves that are not in these simple integer ratios like the fifth or the octave, then they're off from each other, and that is also unpleasant. So there is a biological component. But more than that, there's a big cultural component, which is what we expect to hear makes us feel that something is pleasant or unpleasant. And so I guess that is a good segue into the history of harmony and tuning and all of that.
Wow, that is a lot, and a really cool understanding of the way that we perceive those sounds. And thank you so much for sharing that sine wave. And it was helpful to see it too, at least for me. I don't know about you, Whitney.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, yes. Absolutely. And that ties in a whole bunch to what I hope to be a very short or somewhat short discussion of all of tonal harmony. So today's okay. This is where I should have prepared with like a very strong beverage before getting here. Okay, so the history of tonal harmony in 5 minutes. So where do I want to start? I know, right? I probably don't want to start any earlier than maybe organum, because that starts off our discussion with certainly a preference for intervals, the distance from one note to another. Our preference for intervals that were pleasing to the ear, and very specifically are what we call perfect in quality. So organum as a vocal practice, and things like Gregorian chant, for example, are musical genres and like historical practices that do preference the unison, the perfect fifth, and the octave. And part of the reason for this is because, and again, we're really just talking about the Western classical canon. We're talking about a very, very, very limited, small slice of musical history. It's one that's been important, but it's not by any means the most important. It just happens to be what we're going to focus on today. But in any event, a lot of early music, especially what we have recorded, transcribed by hand and stuff, was music that was meant for religious purpose, and to essentially underscore a message to a higher being, right? And therefore, like, intervals that were perfect in quality were something that were not going to obscure the direction of the message. And that was pretty key, because a lot of progressions of harmony were about fighting against that very idea. We had some important sort of quasi, or certainly religious documents that outlined what was appropriate to be writing as a composer. And you certainly got in trouble, like in a big way, for breaking these rules. And one of the biggest rules that you could break, at least initially, was to write the tritone. And the reason why the tritone was such and I'm going to leave some of this to Joanie to talk about too, but part of the reason why the tritone was a particularly distasteful interval is because it was thought to evoke the devil in music. It was also a very dissonant interval, despite its open kind of qualities. And when we talk about dissonance, dissonance to us kind of does feel good sometimes, just kind of like scratching an itch. But the idea is that the itch stops itching at some point, right? So dissonance to us feels good as like a temporary kind of like, ooh, that doesn't feel good, but it like resolves to something real nice. So as we go forward in history, our very, like, broadly speaking, our acceptance of dissonance has generally grown, I would say, certainly from the time of organum and writing music that really puts forth these like only perfect kind of intervals. And I think kind of we hear it a little bit, obviously, as we transition into not just having perfect intervals, but preferencing intervals of thirds, tertian harmony. We start like moving into the Baroque era, J.S. Bach, and who's really obviously an essential composer in establishing part writing rules that deal with the very idea of dissonance, that tension that then resolves to consonance, that feeling of rest that we have in music. Just like any really important fashion trend that we have, what happens in one era is going to be very unfashionable in the next era, and sort of vice versa, right? So I don't want to even talk about fashion trends that I wish were not coming back now, but you know, history repeats itself in a weird circular way, but also kind of makes strange commentaries on itself. So the Romantic era composers were like, oh man, that one interval that was really outlawed for a long time, do you suppose we could like write every single composition ever that uses the absolute crap out of that interval? Everyone's like, hold my drink, absolutely. So we have a lot of composers in the Romantic era that make good use of that particular interval, and we'll continue on looking at that progression and being more accepting of dissonance as we charge into the 20th and 21st century.
Cool, cool. I picture, since it's a rule breaking scenario, I picture the Romantic composers like wearing leather jackets and smoking and being like, we're going to use this interval. I know that's
absolutely, but like it's not really far off from like what Paganini was doing, right? With his like crushed velvet suits and like the huge cravats and like making women faint and stuff.
I mean, speaking of fashion coming back, I would love for crushed velvet suits and huge cravats.
They were back. They were back for a while.
Right?
In the 90s. It's been a while. It's time for them to come back again.
It's time.
I don't think I had enough money to invest in that fashion trend in the 90s.
Oh, no. But I admired it on other people.
Middle school Joanie really loved crushed velvet. It's very
Admit it. Contemporary Joanie also loves crushed velvet.
Contemporary Joanie does, but it's a secret love.
Much like the love of the tritone, one might say.
Right.
Segue.
Right, segue into, we're going to talk a little bit about temperament. And so we've been talking about intervals, and intervals are just the distance between two pitches. So not even what Kamala played, where it was a single pitch, but not fully. Once you started to hear it as two intervals, that was something entirely different. And she mentioned early on the idea of roughness or tonal tension, as Whitney said as well. That's what defined dissonance. So then what the heck is temperament, and why is that even relevant? So musical temperament was a response to the discovery that nature's proportions just kind of do their own thing. They're like a toddler at a picnic who like takes off their pants and does a dance. And this did not work for Western composers as they were trying to create pieces, especially as they were trying to create musical pieces for an ensemble that sounded good together. And by ensemble, I am referring both to choirs and to instrumental ensembles. So musical temperament is primarily, as we've mentioned before, it's very cultural. It's about Western Eurocentric music. The word temperament derives from a couple of places. The Latin temperare, which means to tamper with. The French tempere, to mix ingredients proportionally, because of course the French would make it about cooking. Plenty of butter mixed into their temperament. The Old English temprian, which means to regulate. The word to temper in modern English means to make morally suitable, as in the temperance movement. And if you're a good pet mom or dad, you give your pet a shot for distemper so that they don't have that. So temperament has appeared throughout music history in a variety of means and ways. The big three in that are Pythagorean tuning. And in Pythagorean tuning, that's the tuning of a scale where all the fifths and the fourths are pure. So this is based on this idea of like string length ratios. So they wanted things for it to be pure, it had to be between multiples of 2 and 3, but no larger prime numbers. Remember that, because we're going to come back to that later. So the ratio for an octave is 2 to 1. So Kamala mentioned earlier, 440 hertz cycles per second for a sine wave. That's A on the, I won't reach for it, it's too far away. So an octave higher than that is A 880. So 440 hertz per second, or cycles per second, 880. So it doubles going up an octave. So ratio of 2 to 1. An interval of a fifth is 3 to 2. So anything with a number greater than 4, we perceive as dissonant, in that they start to cancel each other out. Now the next two types of temperament, I once saw a university piano technician and the head of a music theory department almost come to a physical fist fight about just intonation versus equal temperament. And that is a fight I would love to see in a ring in Las Vegas. So in just intonation, the intervals are tuned so that they do not beat. And what are beats? Well, they're not just headphones manufactured by Dr. Dre, and they're not things that make you dance. Beats, as Kamala played for us earlier, it's that audible pulsating change, that wah 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 wah, pulsating change in sound volume that comes when two notes or two strings are tuned so that their partials, they're part of the overtone series, have slightly different frequencies, right? So one of the problems with just intonation is that the math, you know how we were saying that musical temperament's a response to nature, like kind of doing its own thing. The math doesn't entirely work all the way through. So 1/5, one singular fifth is flat, and it sounds like a howling of a wolf, and was called a wolf tone, and it was something that many composers were just like, we'll just deal with it. Or they used it as a color intentionally. So then we're getting to equal temperament, which is how a piano is tuned. Equal temperament, by the way, is, for those of you who are watching, that's what you hear every day. What you hear most of the time, unless you work in an early music ensemble, is equal temperament. Pop, jazz, modern classical, most other styles, any music you hear in the grocery store or kind of in the like public sphere of what is normal, you know, obviously not people who get together and talk about musicology while wearing devil horns and witches' hats and all of our other accoutrements. That's, you hear equal temperament. So in that, the octave is divided into 12 equal uniform semitones. The math for this, by the way, was not calculated by a European white person. It was first calculated by a Chinese mathematician and philosopher, Xu Zaiyu. And forgive my pronunciation, I'm pretty sure I'm using the Hong Kong one, but I'm not fluent in Mandarin, sorry guys. But he calculated equal temperament in 1584, so dibs. In equal temperament, beats are only discernible and they're countable in consonant intervals. Now here's a super annoying thing about equal temperament. Some piano tuners stretch octaves, especially in the upper treble and the lower bass, for melodic reasons over harmonic reasons. It's part of what gives the instrument the color itself. And if you want to be more of a nerd about that, you can read L.S. Lloyd's 1940 article, The Myth of Equal Temperament, or you could read Stuart Isakoff's Temperament. It'll help you fall asleep at night.
So I always thought about like our current system of tuning is kind of like cooking the books a little bit, like fudging the numbers, like, hey, like, you know, just like kind of make it happen.
Right, like I'm making music so that I wouldn't have to take math classes.
Yes.
I only count to 4.
Or like, it's like when you are cooking and you put just a lot of butter in because you don't actually know how to season well. I mean, I've never done that.
Same thing applies to garlic though, right?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Does anyone actually put in the recommended amount of garlic in?
No.
I was like, why don't you just say garlic to taste?
Right.
And just assume everyone's going to put a whole bottle of crushed garlic in.
No, seriously.
Yeah.
I don't understand the seasonings of most recipes. I have to put like extra chili peppers and hot sauce on everything.
I'm there.
Yeah.
Joanie, that was fascinating. You are such a temperament nerd.
Each of your topic coverage was fascinating as well. So now we're gonna go through some more musical examples and talk about the devil's interval throughout history. So with that understanding of temperament, we're going to jump right into the medieval and the Renaissance. And I don't have any musical examples for them because they're really hard to find.
They don't like the devil in medieval times.
Well, it's actually interesting that didn't, and we'll find out where that nickname came.
Yes.
Because in the medieval era, Jacobus of Liège, a Franco-Flemish theorist, he was born circa 1620 and he died 1330-ish. Because time is meaningless, and
Just like it is now. Just like it is now.
So like if I die, it'll be like she died in 2020 something. I don't know. We don't need to keep track. But he wrote what is now the largest surviving medieval treatise on music, the Speculum Musicae, 5 volumes. Book 1 was all consonants and dissonance. Book 2 was consonants and dissonance. Book 3, the entire book, is a numerical discussion of proportions and intervals. So those of you who are having insomnia because of the pandemic, 3 o'clock in the morning when the cat wakes you up singing, you can rock yourself back to sleep reading Jacobus of Liège, Speculum Musicae, Book 3. It's interesting that he notes in his book, he distinguishes the augmented fourth from the diminished fifth. They are not the same as they would be if you played a tritone on the piano. Different notes entirely. And one of the things that he noted, especially in his writing, is that these are hard to sing. They're just hard. They're just hard to sing, especially when they're 2 separate intervals. So if it's hard to sing just one person, how hard is it to sing with 2 or more people? He does note in Book 2 specifically about the diminished fifth, and I have seen it, although rarely, in ecclesiastical plain songs. So it was used, it just wasn't used that frequently. So the rumors that it was banned in the medieval period are just that. They're rumors. It's like believing internet memes are news. Sorry, I had to.
I'm not going to make a QAnon joke. Not going to do it.
But definitely frown down upon writing.
Yes.
Absolutely.
In part because, don't write things that the singers can't do.
A lot of people could learn that lesson.
People could still learn that lesson today.
Yeah.
That's so in the Renaissance, where there was this rediscovery of the ancient Greek and Roman texts. So remember Pythagorean tuning, the idea that that these intervals in multiples of 2 and 3 are good, and things that are not, and are prime numbers, etc., above 4 are really bad. An augmented fourth has a proportion of 45 to 32, and a diminished fifth has a proportion of 64 to 45. So that very much falls into a hell no.
Yeah.
So they just didn't do it. So where do we get this idea of the devil's interval? It's not just that it wasn't pure or pleasing to God, as Whitney noted. It was that it was hard to sing, it was impossible to tune, and if you were using more than one person, if you were doing a medieval ecclesiastical plain song, only one person's singing that. But if you're doing organum, if you're starting to write for choirs as they did in the Renaissance, if you're doing polyphony, it's just not going to work. It's not going to sound good. It was ugly, certainly for the way that they were tuning. But the first known use of the word tritonus occurs in the 9th or 10th century in an organum treatise, Musica in Kyriadis, though it wasn't explicitly prohibited until the development of Guido di Arezzo. And those of you taking your first music history class, you'll know about the Guidonian hand.
Guido!
Until Guido's hexachord system, it wasn't prohibited. But from then until the end of the Renaissance, the tritone earned its nickname, Diabolus in Musica, and was regarded as unstable and rejected for use.
I would like to note that we didn't choreograph that dance earlier. We didn't know that Guido was going to show up, but if this isn't the dance move
I know.
Through for musicology, I don't know.
TikTok people. It's up to you now. TikTok.
So those of you who are taking your musicology and music history classes, that's the official dance.
I love it. Excellent.
Yes.
All
Hi,
right.
Annie. Are you going to do the dance with us?
Oh my God, I love it.
Now we're going to continue to the later eras, and we have some musical examples where you can hear the tritone working hard in action. So I'm going to turn it over to Whitney for the classical era.
My gosh. Okay. So, again, it's because of the sort of distaste for this interval in the first place, we don't hear it a ton in the classical era. However, we do hear some pretty bold flirtations with dissonance in general. And the one that I really wanted to showcase from the classical era is, of course, from the man who embodies the classical era himself. It is Mozart, right? So when I first actually heard this piece, I definitely didn't believe it was by Mozart. So maybe instead of talking about it ahead of time, why don't we go ahead and listen to if our DJ will indeed cue it up, I'll cue us to.
Yes, thank you, DJ Annie Hyatt.
Yeah. Yeah, so when I first heard the beginning of this dissonance quartet, I was like, Mozart, no way! What do you think you're doing? What's really awesome about this is it plays radically with your idea of tension and resolution. So typically we hear, especially in the classical era, what I kind of liken to the perfect chocolate chip cookie recipe, which, like, if you've made chocolate chip cookies, sorry, I'm obviously hungry right now. So if you've made chocolate chip cookies before, hopefully if you looked at a recipe to make chocolate chip cookies, you think you got butter, sugar, flour, and you're going down the list. I hope you remember that some salt is actually really necessary in your ideal chocolate chip cookie. And if we liken the idea of salt to dissonance, we have that kind of a blend that happens in the classical era, where we have the perfect chocolate chip cookie that has just like a tinge of salt to it to bring out the sweetness. And what Mozart is doing here is, instead of he's made us a kind of like really salty chocolate chip cookie up front, where we get to take a sweet bite followed by a bitter, like a really sour or like salty bite.
So it's like a salted caramel.
Ooh, yeah. And it happens in layers, where, like, if you think about dissonance as being this like kind of crunchy sort of motion, it kind of feels like taffy, where it pulls and pushes apart from itself. And Mozart definitely knew what he was doing here. The whole piece doesn't go on like that, because it actually it kind of makes us feel a little bit not at ease, because it's going back between those motions so much. but Mozart is doing it to a particular effect here. And pretty much after the point that we stopped, we get into pretty pleasant tertiary and harmony area where we're really working with the functional ideas of harmony, thinking about the circle of fifths and prioritizing the motion from the dominant to the subdominant and to the tonic, of course, but not stressing dissonance or the tritone, certainly. And
it pretty quickly becomes the consonants quartet.
Yes, it does indeed. It's like dissonance introduction.
Like in this era, that it's more of a party trick.
Yep, indeed. Yes, it is. It's much more like a flashy, showy thing about like, look at how many rules I can break and then unbreak and then break and then unbreak right in front of you than anything else. So Mozart was really kind of ahead of his time in what he was doing, but it was for the sake of fun and humor.
Yes, because an audience in that time would have found that funny.
Yes, absolutely. They would have been like pleasantly overjoyed with that. It's almost like being on a roller coaster. Like technically, like a roller coaster shouldn't be really fun to us, right? But we love the thrill of putting our lives in danger. Yes, or feeling that unpleasant like drop of
putting our lives in danger when we know it's going to come to a safe end.
Exactly. We know he's not going to leave us there. He's going to bring us back.
Totally.
Right. Yep. Cool. So what's next? What's our next musical example?
We could probably talk about Saint-Saëns real quick, unless we want to.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now this is getting into the Halloween playlist.
So where do I even start with Camille Saint-Saëns' Danse Macabre? If there's any piece that is about, it's about Halloween. It's a tone poem, so it's a single self-contained piece of music that tells a story, and it's about death. And death shows up at the stroke of midnight every Halloween to dance the dance of death with all of the dead. And the dance of death, by the way, is not like stomping on your grave. It's a beautiful waltz. And how are we to know that this is even a death waltz of sorts? Well, we have a violin that kicks off our whole cinematic experience, because it sort of evokes an image within the listener, right? The image that Saint-Saëns paints is initially we have the striking of at midnight we hear the harp strike midnight, 12 strikes, and then all of a sudden we have this very light pizzicato transition, and we have this awful tritone with a scordatura violin. And the violin has a shape that's very similar to a human body. So also has this like this human soul representation that's happening here. So we're falsely tuning the instrument, a technique scordatura, to make the instrument play a tritone when it typically would play perfect intervals. And I think probably with that we'll play maybe the first minute or so of Camille Saint-Saëns' Danse Macabre. It's midnight, the clock has just struck 12. And death is going to enter. piece. It's on my bucket list of things that I would love to conduct one day. I've definitely memorized it at this point. But what happens, of course, because no unresolved plot points can be left unresolved at the end. So Halloween comes to a close. Everyone dances this glorious dance, a beautiful dance of death. And then all of a sudden, the sun comes up. We have this oboe call, this. I so encourage you to, by the way, listen to the whole thing. And then we have this tremolo, this string tremolo, this, and then our poor death violin, like, has a solo moment before death sort of escapes.
Honestly, I would be okay with you just performing it in its entirety.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like maybe I should do just a solo one-man band version of it. Absolutely. There's an audience for it, right?
There absolutely is. If you make a video of that and share it on YouTube, I will watch it 1,000,000 times.
Okay, see, this is where I will get internet famous. But yeah, so the Romantic composers, Camille Saint-Saëns in particular, was like, hey, this tritone, do I have a plot point for you to discover with it? And so if you haven't heard the whole piece, please at some point listen to it. But the 20th and 21st centuries, my gosh, they had a heyday with stuff. Go ahead and take it over.
Sure. So, oh my God. So, where to start even with the 20th and 21st centuries is that all bets are off. We've let go of the diatonic scale. We don't have any rules anymore. So what does the tritone even mean? Well, what's interesting is that it seems to mean what it used to mean, but now it's in a purposeful, conscious way. So when you use the tritone or when you think about the tritone, there's always this little voice in the back of your head that says, oh, that's the devil's interval. What am I going to do with that? And so I think what's really interesting is this sort of semiotic association that the tritone has taken on. Even if it didn't necessarily connote the devil early on, we all know as people who are making music and performing music now, we know that is the secret symbolism behind it. And so what's interesting is that a lot of the way that it's used, it's not just as a cool dissonant interval, which, the use of cool dissonant intervals, you can see examples of ninths all over the place, like Thelonious Monk and all of these other uses of these intervals that are not found in traditional counterpoint. But the tritone, the use of the tritone often seems to be specifically referring to its past. Like it can't escape what it used to be. And we see this in the last example that we're going to look at tonight, which is Black Angels by George Crumb. And this piece is so full of symbolism. So Crumb is composing this piece in an era that is not so dissimilar from where we are now, right? So the Vietnam War is ongoing, the country is torn apart by protests, and it's a dark time. And the path of this piece is from darkness into light. So the way that it is constructed is this sort of palindromic journey where we start off with the descent of the soul, and by the end of the piece, we get to the soul finding some kind of redemption and lightness. So especially in the first triptych, the piece unfolds in these 3 large sections, which overall make up 13 scenes. And the numerology is very, very important to Crumb, and that 7 and 13 represent fate and destiny. The 3 represents the Trinity of God, but also perhaps the demonic depths. And the tritone itself is referring very specifically back to this idea of the devil. And you can really see this in the excerpt that we're going to listen to right now, which is called Devil Music. So he is not shying away from the association with that interval. It's very specifically meant to evoke this idea of darkness and what the depths of hell are like in the midst of this ongoing war that we have come into as kind of a colonialist impulse. We're not going to talk about that part. We're going to talk about the tritone. So let's listen to the excerpt from Black Angels. Thank you, DJ Igor. Yeah.
Boy,
So
it really just does get stuck in your head. I just
yeah,
An
can't.
earworm,
an
absolutely.
earworm. But
Yeah.
it's what's so interesting to me just looking at the score also is that it's the same tritone as we saw earlier on, right, in the Mozart, that E to D sharp thing. So I don't know what's going on there. Some like
Yeah, I wonder
cosmic
if that's
significance.
intentional or an homage, perhaps.
Yeah.
By the way, I really like the expression palindromic journey. I'd like that to be a band. That's my band name now. I used to play
That is
bass.
our band now
I
for
used to
next
play
time.
bass for Palindromic Journey.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
just a Journey cover band, but we change all of the perfect fifths to tritones.
Yes. And we also do all the lyrics backwards.
Yes, we're overwhelmingly unpopular.
Yes. Well, I mean that wouldn't change things for me very much, but
This
that's
Right.
fine.
We'd still make that music, and joyfully so.
The score that we saw looked so different from the Mozart, though, even in the way it's laid out. Do you want to? You want to say? I would love to hear your thoughts on it.
I mean, I can nerd out on this forever, but like one of the really spectacular things about the way that Crumb made this piece is that it's not just about the harmonic journey, it's also about the timbral journey through the piece. So we started off talking about consonance and dissonance, and one of the things that creates a musical sound is the consonance that's inherent in what is called the timbre, right? Which is actually what the sound itself is, right? So most sounds that we hear are not pure tones. They're not sine waves. Instead, they're made up of many different sounds layered on top of each other. All of these frequencies working together to make some kind of beautiful violin or cello or voice. But what Crumb is doing here is sort of dissecting what the idea of a beautiful sound is. Because in European classical music in particular, we have this very specific idea about what musical sound is. And it's constructed of these same consonant overtones that we were talking about before, right? So you can hear a set of noisy overtones if you just like smack a box or kick a wall or something. That is not what we would normally consider a musical sound. And the instruments that we engage with in European classical music are very specifically designed to only create those beautiful consonant overtones. But what you saw in the score and what Crumb engages with throughout the piece is taking this instrument, a violin in this case, a string quartet, and deconstructing it so that now they are introducing noise and those dissonant devil sounds into the actual body of the instrument by the way that they're being instructed to play, which is pretty spectacular.
Yeah, it's also probably worth mentioning though, like in addition, like Camille Saint-Saëns and George Crumb both decide on the violin.
Yes.
Instrument. It's like he had a string quartet, which I mean, he only had two other instruments, but he could have gotten some very interesting timbres out of the cello and certainly the viola as well. So interesting that he chose the violin to showcase in this particular movement as well.
Yes, as the voice of the devil again.
Exactly. Yeah. Totally. Right, and then also like the string quartet is not just acoustic as well. Like we have all sorts of other instruments that are invited into the ensemble, but additionally, like they're electronic as well. Like, so do you have an idea as to like or can you say something about like the yeah, oh my god, do it.
Sure. I mean like that what the electronics do is they remove this harmonic acoustic environment that we've been dealing with this whole time. In the first place, we're in a totally new world now. And not only that, but he's asking these things of the players that were really groundbreaking at the time, like bowing above the bridge and knocking on the instrument and then asking them, they yell things in Hungarian in the middle. There's all of this stuff going on in this piece that is not what European classical music asks you to do at all. So we move, the whole idea of the devil's interval as a melodic underpinning of the piece, but then paired with these things that are non-musical sounds is just it's really an incredible piece. I hope that everybody will listen to it if they haven't.
Totally. And even the excerpt that we played, which has the score is a piece of artwork itself, and it uses this technique called a cutaway, right? The idea that if you don't see anything, there's nothing there. And what I have found is even like people who don't quote unquote read music, like I understand that that's a skill that it takes many years to perfect, but even people who don't read music can actually follow along pretty well with a George Crumb score. So even if you feel like you might not understand, like you try your hand at it. It's actually quite fun. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we certainly encourage those listeners and watchers at home, if you're unfamiliar with these pieces, give a listen to them in their entirety. They are really, really magnificent and interesting, especially now that you know so much of the context for them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And of course, like the tritone does not escape us in the popular music realm either. We sort of temporarily bypassed our discussion. It's like we have two very clear, obvious examples that happen within our sort of popular culture canon, whatever that might be.
Without breaking copyright.
Oh yeah, that's true. I think we can make mention of it.
Or Joanie can hint at it.
You can't own an interval, just like
True.
You can't own a key. But The Sims. I'm just gonna leave it there. You can finish it on your own at home, or if you're a musical theater fan from West Side Story, you of course know Marie.
So what I love about The Simpsons in particular is like, okay, so I hope everyone's seen The Simpsons at this point who's tuning in.
I mean, you have 31 years of it.
Okay, right. It's at this point you should know
ubiquitous things of our culture.
So it's about a dysfunctional family, though, right? And so I think the opening interval there, like a dysfunctional family that has pretty good intentions despite all of it, and that's wrapped up into the first 1, 2, 3 pitches, right? You have this tritone, this dissonance that doesn't sound good that ultimately resolves, and I think that's generally the format of The Simpsons. Like you don't leave episodes unresolved, right? Like there is some sort of conclusion.
Everything like the old school way of thinking of television, everything returns back to the way it started.
Yes.
In this episode. So.
And the baby never gets older.
He never gets older.
Totally.
No one grows.
In the case of, does anyone want to talk about West Side Story in terms of what that interval might mean there? I can.
I mean, I that and this is something that we can certainly debate. And if you're writing a research paper, you can certainly argue for this. Cat appearance.
I know the Simpsons called him to us. The tritone has called him here.
Oh my gosh.
Tritone has summoned the black cat.
Yes.
I was like, all right.
So if you're not familiar with the story, it is a retelling of Romeo and Juliet, and it's set in New York City. And it is about a forbidden love between two people who come from different cultural backgrounds. What could be more exemplified of a tritone that has resolution than yearning for a woman that is not appropriate for you, but that you actually love? He also uses sevenths prominently in the musical as well. Those two intervals kind of circle the whole story throughout.
Yeah, I love this idea that the first time that it's hinted at a number of times within the orchestral considerations of the underscoring that happens, but when Tony first sings, like Maria, it's this idea, or at least it feels to me this idea of like, the search has come for an end a little bit, that like there's this stress that can finally be voiced, that there's like a completion to that sound. And it like I think obviously the composer is such a grand genius at creating such a catchy thing with just like, and it's her name, over and over and over again. I was like, oh man, the lyricist got paid a lot of money for this one particular tune for being a lot of her name, maybe. But it's still, what's in a name? A lot's in a name.
But what's interesting about the way that the name is set, though, is that the stress is not on the right? It's Maria, so the stress is on the tritone, and then it kind of softly resolves after that. So it's really, really clever.
Yeah. This idea that like love is painful in a way too. I don't know. There's so much which is one of the grand beauties about music, right? That like so much can be said with so little. And then that observation reminds me also of how utterly slow opera moves and how it says nothing over a really long course of time as well. So music can either move really, really, really quickly or tragically slowly, but never at an appropriate pacing for our liking the end.
I think that's a great place for us to wrap up. Any final thoughts from either of you on the Devil's Interval?
Don't fear it.
Yes.
Yes.
Unless it's a descending one. Those are still,
all right.
I mean, just like in the MIDI, those are hard to sing.
They are.
Intervals in general are real difficult. We have a much easier time with ascent than descent. We climb stairs easier than we fall down them. My closing thought regarding the tritone is like anyone who's tritone curious at this point, get your curiosity on.
Try curious.
Try curious. You get in with that interval that divides the octave equally into two parts.
Great. Well, and we will be back. We have 2 episodes that will be coming to you in October because, I mean, it's the Musicology Horror Show. Of course we're going to have 2 in October. And the next one, the theme is priming and horror soundtracks. There's going to be a jump scare, and the jump scares get me every time.
Here's the problem. Like, you can't watch it. It's like if there's music, you're screwed. If there's no music, you're also screwed. So you're screwed for the whole film.
Yeah. Which is why you watch. Admit it.
It's very, very uncomfortable or very funny to watch a horror movie with me because of my inability to...
Well, now we know, Joanie, don't we?
Yes, we do, and I fully expect the 2 of you to take advantage of
Your diary. Guess what I found out today?
Coming to you through Opera on Tap's channels on October 29th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and DJ Igor is going to share a closing piece with us. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Kamala. Thank you, Whitney, for being co-hosts with me. This was a wonderful delight from all of you.
My name is Boris, and back in '62, the Crypt Kickers and I brought the Monster Mash to you. But now it's a different bag, and mashing is a drag. When the lights grow dim, we now do the Monster Swim. All you would-be monsters, come on in. Boris is going to show you how to Monster Swim. Something like the zombie, but not so slow. A lot like the gravedigger, but not so low. We can't do the monkey or even the dog, 'cause they've both been eaten by the blob.
We do the swim.
It's a poolside smash.
The master swim.
It's bigger than the mash. Here we are swimming under the full moon. The werewolf and the creature from the Black Lagoon. Dracula, what do you think of my new smash? Whatever happened to the Monster Mash? It's a poolside smash. It's bigger than the mash. vampire are flying in out of the night. Even the Beatles are shaking their tones, dancing to the swim band of the Rolling Bones. It's a poolside smash. It's bigger than the mash. Give it a try, Igor. To swim is a gas. It's better than the mash.